In the quiet town of Meadow Grove, nestled between rolling hills and a whispering forest, there stood a small, unassuming roadside diner called Whispering Pines. The diner was a sanctuary for weary travelers and locals alike, offering comfort food and a warm atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the chill of the encroaching night. The neon sign flickered softly in the rain, casting an inviting glow that promised respite from the storm brewing outside. Lauren, a young woman with dark curls pulled back into a practical ponytail, wiped down the counter with a practiced efficiency. Her name tag read Lauren, and she moved with the tired but determined energy of someone used to long shifts. The aroma of fresh coffee, grilled burgers, and toasted bread filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of an old radio playing a slow blues tune. The wooden floor creaked slightly under the weight of the patrons, mostly truckers hunched over their meals, seeking solace from the damp chill outside. The bell above the door chimed softly as Roman Reigns stepped into the diner. His imposing figure commanded attention, but his deep, calm voice and gentle demeanor put those around him at ease. He scanned the modest interior, his eyes lingering on the few patrons before settling on Lauren behind the counter. "Good evening, sir. What can I get you?" Lauren asked, her voice steady despite the flicker of curiosity in her brown eyes. Roman returned the smile, his voice calm. "Double burger, fries, and a coffee, please." Lauren nodded, jotting down the order in her notepad. "Coming right up." She turned towards the kitchen, but something about the stiffness in her shoulders caught Roman's attention. It wasn't just exhaustion. There was tension there, a guarded look in her eyes, as if she was expecting something unpleasant to happen. Roman settled into a corner booth, stretching his legs and leaning back against the seat. He wasn't looking for trouble tonight, just a meal and some peace. But his years in the ring and his time navigating the real world had honed his instincts. Something felt off. He noticed how Lauren's movements became a little faster, her head tilting towards the door slightly, as if listening for something. Suddenly, the front door slammed open with a force that made the bell jangle violently. The air in the diner seemed to shift as 5 men strode in, their presence alone enough to change the atmosphere. Leather jackets with faded patches, heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor, and a lingering stench of motor oil and cigarette smoke trailed behind them. They weren't here for food. The leader, a stocky middle-aged man with gray hair and a deep scar running across his cheek, surveyed the room with casual arrogance. His name was Rick, and the moment his pale blue eyes landed on Lauren, his lips curled into a smirk. "Well, well, look at this," Rick drawled, walking to the counter and planting both hands down with a loud slap. "Our favorite little waitress is still here. Thought you would have learned by now, girl." Lauren's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the counter, her voice steady despite the sharp edge of tension. "Whatever you want, I'm not giving it to you." One of the other bikers, a lanky man with a chipped tooth, laughed. "Oh, I think you will. You always do, eventually." Lauren held her ground. "This is a business, not your playground." Rick let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in amusement. He reached out and plucked a sugar packet from the counter, rolling it between his fingers as if considering something. "See? That's where you're wrong. This diner is in our territory, which means you pay if you want to keep it running. It's how things work around here." The tension in the room thickened, suffocating in its weight. The other patrons in the diner looked away, their heads ducked down, pretending not to notice. Fear was a familiar scent here, and Roman hated it. Lauren stood her ground, her voice steady despite the tension. I told you last time, I'm not giving you a damn cent. Rick sighed dramatically, tossing the sugar packet onto the counter. See, I don't like that attitude. That kind of disrespect gets people into trouble. He turned to his men. Doesn't it, boys? The chip-toothed biker grinned, stepping forward. Oh yeah, big trouble. The third biker, a wiry guy with a tattoo crawling up his neck, suddenly reached over and knocked over a tray of silverware, sending a clatter of knives and forks onto the floor. Lauren flinched, but she held her ground. Rick leaned in closer to Lauren, lowering his voice just enough for the threat to feel more personal. You either pay up, or bad things start happening. Windows get broken. Fires start. People get hurt. He reached for her wrist, but Roman moved before he could think. His hand shot out, catching Rick's wrist in a grip so strong it made the biker suck in a sharp breath. A dead silence fell over the diner. Rick turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing as he registered the iron hold on his arm. His gaze traveled up to meet Roman's face, recognition dawning as the biker took in the broad shoulders, the massive forearms, and the calm but unmistakably dangerous look in his eyes. One of the bikers whispered, "That's Roman Reigns." Roman didn't move or speak. His fingers dug into Rick's wrist just enough to send a message, a warning. Rick chuckled, but there was an edge of unease in it. Well, damn, he mused. Looks like we got ourselves a celebrity. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, but Rick's pride wed with common sense. He hesitated, the heavy presence of the man holding his wrist like a steel vise. Then something changed in his expression. The hesitation vanished, replaced by something darker. You think being a big-time wrestler means something in the real world? Rick sneered, wrenching his arm free and stepping back. News flash, tough guy. This ain't the ring out here. Your moves don't mean shit. The bikers laughed, their unease evaporating. Roman remained unmoved, his expression calm, but his muscles taut, ready. He knew how this worked. Guys like Rick thrived on fear, on the power they had over those too afraid to stand up to them. They wanted to intimidate, to make him react first. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Rick noticed Roman's lack of fear and scoffed. Look at him, boys. All that muscle, and he's just going to sit there. He leaned in, resting his hands on the table, his breath reeking of whiskey and cheap cigarettes. Tell me something, Reigns. How's it feel to be outnumbered for once? Roman lifted his eyes to meet Rick's, his gaze like steel. I've been in worse situations. Rick's smirk faltered for just a second. Then he straightened and nodded toward his men. Teach this Hollywood punk a lesson. The first move came fast. The chip-toothed biker lunged forward, swinging in a heavy right hook aimed at Roman's jaw. But Roman had already seen it coming. He ducked at the last second, the punch grazing over his head. In a single motion, he drove his shoulder into the biker's gut, lifting him off his feet and slamming him onto the table with a loud crash. Plates shattered, silverware scattered, and the entire table buckled under the impact. The diner erupted into chaos. Another biker, the one with the neck tattoo, tried to grab Roman from behind, wrapping an arm around his throat. Roman reacted instantly, grabbing the biker's wrist and twisting it sharply. The man let out a pained yell, but Roman wasn't finished. With one powerful motion, he hoisted him up and slammed him down in a modified belly-to-belly suplex. The floorboards shook from the impact. The third biker, a burly man with a thick beard, grabbed a chair and swung it at Roman's back. The wood splintered on impact, but Roman barely flinched. He turned, eyes flashing, and drove a devastating elbow into the biker's face, sending him sprawling into a booth. Rick's smirk had vanished. He wasn't laughing anymore. One of his remaining men hesitated before pulling out a switchblade. Lauren gasped, but Roman was faster. He sidestepped just in time, grabbing the man's wrist and slamming it against the counter, forcing him to drop the weapon. Before the biker could react, Roman gripped him by the collar and sent him flying across the diner, where he landed with a painful thud against a jukebox, making the music cut out abruptly. Now, it was just Rick. The leader of the gang stood there, his eyes flicking between his groaning, fallen men and Roman, who hadn't even broken a sweat. The remaining customers, who had been hiding behind tables and booths, slowly peeked out, their expressions a mix of shock and awe. Roman cracked his neck and took a step forward. Rick instinctively reached behind his jacket and pulled out a brass knuckle, slipping it onto his right hand. "You got some fight in you, I'll give you that," Rick growled. "But I ain't like my boys. I know how to take down a big guy like you." Roman smirked. "You sure about that?" Rick lunged, throwing a brutal punch aimed straight at Roman's face. But Roman was faster. He sidestepped, grabbed Rick's arm mid-swing, and with sheer strength, twisted him around before lifting him up. Lauren, who had seen wrestling before, watched in awe as Roman executed a perfect powerbomb, slamming Rick down onto a broken table. The wood snapped under the force, and Rick let out a choked groan before going completely still. The diner fell silent. All 5 bikers were down. Lauren stared, her breath shaky, her heart hammering. Roman dusted off his hands and glanced around the wrecked diner. Booths were overturned, shattered dishes covered the floor, and the jukebox sparked where the last biker had crashed into it. Rick coughed, rolling onto his side, groaning in pain. You're going to regret this," he wheezed. Roman crouched down beside him, his voice low but firm. "No, you're going to regret this. You and your boys are done here." He pointed to the door. "You ever come near this place again, I won't go easy on you next time." Rick said nothing, his breath ragged. Sirens wailed in the distance, and Roman stood up as the distant glow of police lights flashed through the rain-speckled windows. The bikers, barely conscious, groaned as they tried to pull themselves up. Lauren finally found her voice. "Roman, He turned to her, his expression softening. "You okay?" She let out a shaky breath and nodded. I think so." The front door swung open again, but this time it wasn't more trouble. It was the cops. Roman sighed, rolling his shoulders. "Looks like the cleanup crew is here." The flashing red and blue lights painted the rain-slicked pavement outside the diner as 2 police cruisers skidded to a stop. The sirens cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of slamming doors and hurried footsteps. Officers in dark uniforms rushed into the diner, hands on their holsters, scanning the wreckage before them. The scene was pure chaos. Overturned tables, shattered dishes, and 5 battered, groaning bikers sprawled across the floor. Roman Reigns stood near the counter, arms crossed, watching as the officers took in the mess. Lauren was still behind the counter, gripping it so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The few customers who had remained in the diner sat in stunned silence, some whispering among themselves. A tall, broad-shouldered officer with graying hair stepped forward, his name tag reading Sergeant Michaels, He narrowed his eyes at the sight of Rick, still lying atop the shattered remains of a table, barely able to move. The sergeant exhaled through his nose and shook his head. "Well, well, if it ain't Rick and his boys," he said, his tone dry and unimpressed, as if this were far from the first time he had encountered them. He turned his gaze to Lauren. "They giving you trouble again?" Lauren nodded, her voice steadier than before. "They came in demanding money for protection. When I refused, they started threatening me. Then they tried to get physical." Sergeant Michaels let out a tired sigh and pulled out a small notepad. "That sounds about right." He turned to his partner, a younger officer with a sharp jawline. "Call it in. We're taking them in for extortion, assault, and destruction of property." Rick let out a low groan and tried to sit up, but the pain from Roman's power bomb was still keeping him down. This is," one of the other bikers, still holding his ribs from being thrown into the jukebox, nodded weakly. Yeah, we were just minding our own business. He jumped us." Sergeant Michaels raised an eyebrow. "You really expect me to believe that?" Before the officer could respond, a voice from the corner spoke up. "Actually, I got the whole thing right here." All heads turned toward a young man in a trucker cap sitting in a booth near the window. He held up his phone, the screen still recording. Got every second of it. These guys came in harassing the lady, calling her all kinds of racists, knocking things over. They even pulled a knife on him. He gestured toward Roman. Man only fought back when they tried to attack him. Sergeant Michael's expression remained unreadable as he took the phone from the man's hand and watched a few seconds of the footage. Slowly, he nodded. "Well, looks like that settles it." He looked down at Rick, who had gone pale. "Anything else you'd like to add?" Rick clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Michael signaled his officers. "Cuff him." Within seconds, the officers were pulling zip ties from their belts and yanking the bikers to their feet. Rick struggled for a moment, but winced in pain from the fight. One of his men, the one with the broken nose, groaned, "Man, you don't gotta be so rough. You don't gotta be such a dumbass." Michaels muttered, securing his wrists. He looked toward Lauren. "You pressing charges?" Lauren hesitated, her eyes flicking towards Roman, then back at the sergeant. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but there was something else there now. Something firm, unwavering. "Yes." Rick's head snapped up. "What?" Lauren took a breath. "I should have done it the last time they came in here, but I was scared. Not anymore." Rick's face contorted in rage, but Michaels pushed him forward. "You heard her." He looked over at Roman. "You need to come down to the station to give a statement." Roman shook his head. "You got video evidence, witnesses? I think that's enough." Michaels studied him for a second before nodding. "Fair enough. Appreciate what you did here tonight." Roman didn't respond, just gave him a small nod as the officers dragged the bikers toward the door. Rick twisted his head to glare at Lauren. "You're making a mistake, girl. You think this is over? I got people, and they don't like it when one of their own gets locked up." Roman took a single step forward, and Rick immediately shut his mouth, his body tensing involuntarily, remembering the power behind those hands. Roman leaned down just enough to look him in the eye. "This is over. You come near her again, and I won't stop at just putting you through a table." Rick swallowed hard. He believed him. Michaels gave a sharp tug on Rick's cuffs, dragging him out of the diner. One by one, The rest of the bikers were taken outside and stuffed into the back of the cruisers. The sound of the doors slamming shut echoed through the night. Inside the diner, it was silent. The tension had lifted, but the weight of everything that had just happened still lingered. Customers started moving again, some whispering in amazement, others murmuring among themselves. A few people stole glances at Roman, as if still processing that the Roman Reigns had just taken down an entire gang in their small-town diner. Lauren exhaled slowly, running a hand through her curls. She turned to Roman, her expression a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "You didn't have to do that." Roman shrugged. "Yeah, I did." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "You know, you just single-handedly did what I've been too afraid to do for months. Those guys, they've been running this town like it belongs to them. Nobody ever stands up to them." Roman leaned against the counter. "Well, looks like that just changed." Lauren studied him for a moment. "Why'd you step in?" Roman was quiet for a beat before answering. "Because too many people look the other way when this kind of thing happens. I've seen it before. Figured it was about time somebody didn't." Lauren swallowed, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She thought about all the times she had stayed silent, all the times she had let them walk all over her because she was too afraid to fight back. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Me too." Roman gave her a small nod. "You're something else." She smiled a real smile this time. "You sticking around to see what happens?" Roman leaned back, stretching his arms. "Tempting, but I got places to be." Lauren nodded, pretending that didn't disappoint her a little. "Well, I guess I owe you a meal at least." Roman chuckled. "Damn right you do." She grabbed another plate and put together a fresh burger for him, sliding it across the counter. He picked it up, took a bite, and nodded in approval. "Now, this is worth the wait." The door opened again, and this time it was one of the younger cops who had been there earlier. He walked up to Lauren and set a card on the counter. "In case you need anything." He looked over at Roman. "You need to come down to the station to give a statement." Roman shook his head. "You got video evidence, witnesses. I think that's enough." The officer studied him for a second before nodding. "Fair enough. Appreciate what you did here tonight." As the officers left, the diner settled into a strange kind of quiet. The remaining customers finished their meals, some still throwing glances at Roman, like they couldn't believe he was actually there. Lauren sighed and leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. "I think I'm going to need about 3 days' worth of sleep after this," she said. Roman smirked. "You and me both." She looked at him again, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Why'd you step in? You didn't owe me anything." Roman leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Because I've seen too many people let fear win, and I'm tired of it." Lauren swallowed, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She thought about all the times she had stayed silent, all the times she had let them walk all over her because she was too afraid to fight back. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Me too." Roman studied her for a second before nodding. "Good." She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're something else." Roman smirked. "So I've been told." Lauren let out a breath, looking around the diner one more time. It was a mess, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a place she was trapped in. It felt like a place worth fighting for, and she had a feeling she wasn't the only one who thought so. The diner had quieted, but the events of the night still lingered in the air. The broken furniture, the shattered glass, the overturned booths, everything told a story of what had happened, a story that would not be easily forgotten. Lauren moved slowly as she cleaned, her hands still shaking slightly, but there was something else in her now, a kind of determination she hadn't felt before. She wasn't just picking up pieces of a broken diner. She was reclaiming something that had been taken from her long ago. Roman Reigns sat at his booth, finally taking a bite of the burger that had gone cold during all the chaos. He chewed thoughtfully, watching Lauren as she worked. She had been through a hell of a night, but she wasn't backing down. He could respect that. He had seen too many people fold under pressure, too many people accept the way things were just because it was easier. But Lauren had made a choice. She had stood her ground. The bell over the diner door jingled, and both of them tensed instinctively. But it wasn't trouble this time. Two officers stepped inside, the younger one from earlier, and an older man who had the tired look of someone who had seen too much of the world. They scanned the room before approaching Lauren. "You the one who called in the charges?" the older officer asked. Lauren straightened. "Yeah, that was me." The officer gave her a nod. "Good. We've been after Rick and his crew for a while now, but nobody ever wanted to go on record. Your statement, plus the footage from that guy's phone, might actually make it stick this time." Lauren felt something loosen in her chest, but she didn't let herself relax just yet. "So they're really being charged?" the officer confirmed. "Oh, yeah. Rick's looking at multiple counts of extortion and assault. The others, same deal. We'll see how much of it holds in court. But they won't be walking free anytime soon." For the first time that night, Lauren let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The younger officer glanced at Roman, his expression shifting slightly. "Not every day we see a guy like you getting involved in something like this." Roman shrugged. "Seemed like the right thing to do." The officer let out a low chuckle. "Well, whatever the case, you sure made an impression." He glanced at the broken furniture. "One hell of a mess, though." Lauren winced, looking around at the destruction. "Yeah, the owner's not going to be happy about this." The officer nodded. "You the manager?" Lauren hesitated. "No, just a waitress. But the owner barely comes around. I practically run the place at this point." The officer nodded. "You let us know if those guys come back. We'll keep an extra patrol near here for the next few weeks just in case." Lauren didn't know how much that would help, but it was something. As the officers left, the diner settled into a strange kind of quiet. The remaining customers finished their meals, some still throwing glances at Roman, like they couldn't believe he was actually there. Lauren sighed and leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. "I think I'm going to need about 3 days' worth of sleep after this," she said. Roman smirked. "You and me both." She looked at him again, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Why'd you step in? You didn't owe me anything." Roman leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Because I've seen too many people let fear win, and I'm tired of it." Lauren swallowed, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She thought about all the times she had stayed silent, all the times she had let them walk all over her, because she was too afraid to fight back. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Me too." Roman studied her for a second before nodding. "Good." She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're something else." Roman smirked. "So I've been told?" Lauren let out a breath, looking around the diner one more time. It was a mess, but for the first time in a long time, It didn't feel like a place she was trapped in. It felt like a place worth fighting for, and she had a feeling she wasn't the only one who thought so. The diner had quieted, but the events of the night still lingered in the air. The broken furniture, the shattered glass, the overturned booths. Everything told a story of what had happened, a story that would not be easily forgotten. Lauren moved slowly as she cleaned, her hands still shaking slightly, but there was something else in her now, a kind of determination she hadn't felt before. The bell over the diner door jingled, and both of them tensed instinctively, but it wasn't trouble this time. The trucker who had recorded the fight walked in, his phone still in his hand, a cautious look on his face. He looked around at the wreckage and let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered. "Looks even worse now that the adrenaline's worn off." Lauren smirked, wiping down the counter. "Yeah, well, guess I'll be busy tomorrow." The trucker walked up to her, his expression turning serious. "Just wanted to say you did good tonight, standing up to them like that." Lauren hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks." He glanced at Roman. "And you, man. I mean, hell, I've seen you on TV, but that was something else." Roman smirked. "Guess I still got it." The trucker chuckled, then held up his phone. "So, about this video, you want me to put it online?" Lauren frowned slightly. "You think it'll help?" The trucker said, "Are you kidding? The whole world's going to see those guys for what they really are. That's one thing when they run around town bullying people, but when they get taken down by Roman Reigns in a diner fight, people are going to pay attention." Roman looked at Lauren, letting her make the decision. She thought about it for a long moment. She had spent so long trying to avoid attention, tried not to make waves, but maybe that was the problem. Maybe people like Rick counted on people like her staying quiet. Maybe it was time to be loud. "Post it," she said. The trucker grinned. "Consider it done." He walked off to a booth and started editing the video. Lauren turned back to Roman. "You think that was the right call?" Roman shrugged. "Doesn't matter what I think. What matters is you're not letting fear make your choices for you." Lauren exhaled. "Guess we'll see what happens." A few more customers had started to return cautiously, stepping inside to see if things were back to normal. The woman who had been clutching her purse earlier sat at the counter and gave Lauren a small smile. "That was incredible," she murmured. "You really showed them." A man near the window nodded. "Yeah, that was the best thing I've seen all year." Another chuckled. "Forget movies. Roman, you should do this full time." Roman smirked, shaking his head. "I'll stick to wrestling." Lauren laughed softly, the first real laugh she had let out in what felt like ages. She turned and grabbed a clean coffee mug. "Well, I don't know about you, but I could really use a cup of coffee." Roman chuckled, sliding into his booth again. "You know what? I think I'll have that burger now." Lauren grinned, already moving toward the kitchen. Outside, the police cars pulled away, their sirens off, but their presence still lingering in the air. The night was quieter now, calmer. The town didn't feel as small anymore, and inside the diner, things finally started to feel right. The diner wasn't fixed, the world wasn't fixed, but something had changed tonight, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. The air in the diner felt different now. The tension that had filled the space just an hour ago had started to dissolve, replaced by something else, something quieter, heavier. The immediate threat was gone. The bikers were in police custody, and yet the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air like the scent of burnt coffee. Lauren stood behind the counter, the phone still in her hand after speaking with the police. Her fingers gripped the receiver a little too tightly. She had done it. She had pressed charges. She had finally taken a stand, but the fear in her chest hadn't disappeared completely. If anything, it had simply changed shape. Roman Reigns was still seated at his booth, his broad frame relaxed, though his sharp eyes took in every detail of the room. He had seen situations like this before, people thinking the battle was over when in reality it was just beginning. Rick's words echoed in his head. "I got people, and they don't like it when one of their own gets locked up." It wasn't an empty threat. He could feel it in his gut. But the question wasn't if Rick's crew would retaliate. It was when. The other patrons of the diner had started moving again, some gathering their things, others murmuring in hushed voices. A few approached Lauren to offer words of encouragement, but most of them simply nodded in her direction, their eyes filled with something that looked like relief. They had seen her stand up to them. They had seen Roman take them down. And now, for the first time in a long time, maybe there was hope. Lauren exhaled and set the phone down, rubbing her temples. She felt exhausted. Her body still buzzed with the leftover adrenaline from the fight, but her mind was already racing ahead to what might come next. She turned to look at Roman. "You really think they'll come back?" Roman met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yeah,